One of the first things you have to do when starting as a developer in an existing project is dive into the code base and get an understanding of it. That typically means talking to your colleagues, as they know what the code base is about. But as mentioned, a deadline is approaching fast and no one has time for you. Luckily, Copilot can help you with this. I've opened the code base, but no files have been opened yet. Let's ask Copilot. So I'm going to open a chat window here. If I type /, we see that one of the things we can ask Copilot to do is explain the code by using the explain command. So I'd be inclined to write something like explain and then reference the solution, right? And there we go. After a lot of time, Copilot is telling me that it can't answer because there's not enough context provided. So this doesn't give the desired results. Maybe someday, right? But maybe I should just rephrase my question. That's a tip as well. If a question doesn't give the desired results, rephrase it and try again. As mentioned before, working with AI is not an exact science. So let's ask, which use case is solution about? What we get this time is a lot better. It's not completely correct, because it says here that the provided solution context revolves around the development and migration of a database scheme for an order management system, but it does come close. It is indeed an API for an order management system that uses Entity Framework Core. Copilot also figured out that the entity models I've used are the domain model. It tries to explain the DB context. It knows that the migrations are there to apply version-controlled changes to the database schema. It knows what the DTOs are for, and here at the end, we get a very nice high-level view of what the solution does. It's a backend system for managing orders, their order lines, products, and vendors. So with that, you already have a bit of an overview of what this code is all about. But that's just a general overview. Now let's look at the part of the code. I'm going to open the Order Manager database context. Now, as you can see, this is a database context in which I set up the database with DB sets for orders, order lines, products and vendors. I set up all these entities and I provide a bit of dummy data. That's all that's in here, actually. What I can do now is ask Copilot to explain what I have selected. I use the / explain command and I pass through selection. And there we go. This gives me a pretty accurate technical explanation of what this database context does. And if you look at what is written here, you see that it doesn't just give me some general overview what a DB context is for. No, the explanation is really catered to the selection, to my code base. It figured out that I am using a constructor that accepts the DB context options here. It also explains why I do that. It figured out which DB sets I've used. And it explains what a DB set is used for. These properties allow you to query and save instances of these entities. It also says that EF Core uses these properties, so the DB sets, to create the corresponding tables in the database. I wouldn't consider that to be completely correct. So that's still something to keep in mind. AI sometimes hallucinates, it's not always correct, but it does give you a pretty good idea of what this is all for. More information on the onModel creating method and on the seed data method as well. What's also pretty cool here is that we can simply click the words in blue here. For example, when I click the order entity, a code search will start for that order entity. That makes it very convenient to find exactly what Copilot is talking about in your code base. Now, this explanation gives me a pretty good view of what this DB context is for at a technical level. What it doesn't do is give me a functional explanation of the domain. It would be nice if we could have that. But maybe we can ask, right? So, let's ask it to explain the selection in a functional manner. And there we go. We again get an explanation, but this time the explanation isn't as technical as the previous one. For example, down here you get an explanation of what a DB context functionally is for. You also get explanations on what data seeding should be used for, on what database configuration is useful for, and all of that in a functional way. The fact that you can ask Copilot questions like that makes it really easy to learn about the code, but also about what the idea behind the code is. And it doesn't stop there. Let me open another file. I'm going to open the orders handlers here. If you look at this code, and if you've ever built a minimal API before, you can gather that these are the handlers that are executed when a certain API endpoint is called. Let's ask Copilot to explain this. So I'm going to ask it to explain, and orders handlers is the active document I want to reference. Let's have a look at this explanation. As you can read, Copilot figured out that these handlers are indeed executed when HTTP requests come in. It also figured out that they are related to orders in an order management system. And it figured out that they interact with the database using Entity Framework Core, and that AutoMapper is used for mapping. After that, we get a technical explanation of each method. We get the purpose, we get the parameters, we get the process, so the handler's body, and we get what is returned. This is a really convenient way to learn about a codebase. But we can take it one step beyond. This is just the default explanation you get. We didn't ask for something specific. So maybe this time let's ask about the design patterns that are used here. So I'm again going to ask it to explain orders handlers. I'm going to ask it to explain it in a technical manner. And I'm going to ask it to focus on the design patterns that are used. And there we go. This is an explanation of the same code, but in a different way. We see that the repository pattern and unit of work patterns are used. Both of them are implemented through Entity Framework Core. We also see that the data transfer object pattern seems to be used, including an explanation of where and why. It figured out that dependency injection was used to, for example, inject the order manager DB context and an IMapper into the handler methods. It even explains what dependency injection is. It is indeed a form of inversion of control, and so on. What I've often noticed is that this is a pretty good way to actually learn something about the code base, maybe even about code you wrote yourself. I'm kinda happy with the summary here. Apparently the orders handlers file demonstrates a thoughtful application of several design patterns and best practices. Kinda happy with that, seeing I wrote this demo code. But anyway, we'll see how we can improve it throughout the rest of the section. What's interesting here is that the repository pattern is mentioned. As you may or may not know, Entity Framework Core's DB context can be seen as a okay, but not exactly perfect implementation of that pattern. We'll get back to this in the next clip, because this happens to touch upon the feature that the project team is going to ask us to implement. When working like this, often Copilot will suggest questions which you can click for further explanation. Like that, you can keep on learning more. For example, Copilot figured out that I used AutoMapper, and it is suggesting me to ask it to explain what the benefits of using AutoMapper in projects with complex domain models are. As a developer, this is kind of interesting, because you can actually learn new things like this. About C#, about design patterns, or about development and programming in general. It's easy to get caught in this, just like watching a clip on YouTube and 3 hours later wondering where those 3 hours went. You don't have time for that right now, the deadline is creeping closer, and you need to develop a new feature. But let me ask for one more thing. If we look at the program class, we see a few statements in here that may or may not be familiar. However, as you're an ASP.NET Core developer, you know there's multiple ways to build APIs with ASP.NET Core. Let's ask Copilot which approach is used in this project. So I'm going to ask it to explain program.cs, focusing on the high-level ASP.NET core approach used. And there we go. Copilot did figure out, as expected, that the minimal API approach was used here, and it starts explaining the different parts of the program.cs file. This is of course very useful to learn about your application's startup and how the HTTP request pipeline is built. So there we go. With that we got a pretty good explanation of the codebase. We know that the minimal API approach is used. We know that the handlers are defined in orders handlers and related classes. We know that AutoMapper is used for mapping. We know that the handlers call into the order management database context to interact with the underlying data store. And you know that the Order Manager API you're working on is the digital backbone of an order management system, with a domain model that focuses on orders, products and vendor information. That seems like enough info to start developing. By the way, explanations like these will only become better if your codebase is well documented. If your colleagues went through the trouble of documenting the codebase, Copilot will pick that up as well while explaining the codebase to you. Documenting a codebase too is something Copilot can help with, but more on that later. With that, it is now time to implement a new feature.